The ancient peoples of the world worshipped gods and goddesses who were associated with the stars and planets. In fact, planets all were associated with different gods and goddesses, such as Mars and Venus in the Roman system, or Jupiter. And in ancient Mesopotamia, the same planets had the names of their corresponding gods and goddesses. And there was a consistent pattern around the world of observing and understanding a connection between what was going on in the heavens and the gods and goddesses of the sacred stories given to all the different cultures of the world. In fact, we can see that even today we call the planets by the names of these gods and goddesses. And those planets were understood to have the characteristics and the influences associated with those gods and goddesses. And around the world in the ancient times, the different cultures, they had their own gods and goddesses, but they recognized a connection, a worldwide connection. We can see ancient texts that have survived to this day from authors such as Plutarch saying, well, the Egyptians called Jupiter or Zeus Ammon, or they call Dionysus Osiris. There was an understanding that those gods and goddesses were the same. They were just different nations, had different gods and goddesses, but there were parallels. Or the Roman writer Tacitus writes about the German gods and goddesses and said, well, they call Mars this god and they call Hercules that god. There was an understanding that the nations were given gods and goddesses, but they were all relevant. The Romans didn't go around and say, you have to now worship this god or change the name. They understood they were talking about the same influences. And in ancient times, there was also an understanding around the world, and we see this in cultures around the world, that the gods and goddesses and the planetary and celestial influences are also operating on an individual level inside of us. That's the ancient science of astrology. And we find astrology in ancient Mesopotamia, in some of the earliest civilizations known to conventional history. We find astrology in ancient India, in ancient China, in ancient Greece. It is an understanding that the stars and the planets, those gods, are operating within each one of us, and we each have a Mars and a Venus and a Jupiter placement that comes from the time of our birth and from other factors. That was understood. It was a well-developed science in all those ancient civilizations, and this understanding that the gods are connected with the heavens was universal around the world. I've studied myths from every inhabited continent and the islands of the Pacific, and I have shown clear evidence that this is an ancient worldwide system that was understood and used for the benefit of organizing nations and uplifting individuals, operating on these two levels of society and the individual. The understanding of the gods and goddesses and the way these laws and forces and cycles function formed the basis for successful nations to prevent parasites and oligarchs. And the ancient texts talk about that, as I've shown in other videos and in my writings. But something happened. What happened was the arrival of a nation-devouring, parasitic, biblical literalism that came about within the Roman Empire and started to smash the ancient system and dismantle it. And then once it dismantled it within the Roman Empire, this parasitic, nation-devouring biblical literalism started moving through Europe and Africa and Asia to devour those and destroy those systems as well, and to eliminate the understanding of the gods, and also at the same time to outlaw and anathematize the study and use of astrology. So biblical literalism does not recognize and acknowledge the different gods and goddesses given to each of the nations of the world. It wants to smash them down and say, you cannot say that the planets have any divine influence over us, and you cannot study astrology. And yet, these ancient systems were put in place to protect nations and to prevent parasites. What do we see happening after this nation-devouring biblical literalism takes over the Roman Empire? It implodes. It devolves into the Middle Ages, where there really is no nation. There's basically a bunch of gangs, fiefdoms, running around, particularly in the Western Roman Empire, which became Western Europe. These different fiefdoms and gangs of basically warlords were united by Christendom. So Christendom, they all acknowledged the Pope in Rome and this central Christianity, but there was no more nations. There was no more uplifting of the people. It was just a parasitical system of feudalism absorbing the wealth of the people. And by the way, at that time, astrology was outlawed, and the studying of the planets, all that fell into disrepair until the Renaissance, basically. The return of nations happened in conjunction with a breaking away and a reduction of the power of the church. And that struggle has been going on. Nations have been trying to rise out of feudalism, and there's been a struggle going on about that. But I want to talk about this connection between the motions of the planets and what's going on in the celestial sphere and our individual lives that is understood in astrology and is found around the world in all these different cultures around the world. They talk about the influence of the Pleiades. You can find the importance of the Pleiades in the Polynesian cultures of the Pacific. They observed the rising of the Pleiades, and there's a biblical verse that I showed at the beginning. The Bible itself talks about the influence of the Pleiades, the influence of the heavens. You see, the Bible stories themselves are full of truth, just like all the other myths given to the world. The gods and goddesses that are talked about in the stories, or the figures in the Bible stories, those are part of ancient wisdom, but this nation-devouring, parasitic, biblical literalism rejects all of that. But you can even see it in some of the passages that have survived in the biblical scriptures that biblical literalists no longer pay attention to, but they talk about the influence of the Pleiades. So what could be the mechanism by which the planets influence us? Well, I've talked about this, and I've had a blog that's been going on since 2011. You can go back and look through it, and there are some references to astrology. I talk about feng shui, the influence of the shape of a building and the orientation of a building. The height of the ceiling is going to make you feel one way versus a low ceiling will make you feel different. Different types of architecture do make us feel differently, and they have different resonances. And so I've said, look, we can imagine that if something as small as a classical building can change the way we feel, something as large as Jupiter or Saturn or Mars and where it is might actually have an impact on us as well. But today I want to go further than that and connect it with another body of research that I've talked about a little bit in the past, and that is the work of Simon Schack with his Tychos model, where he looks at the amazing discoveries of Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, and Simon Schack looks at his organization of his model of the solar system based on enormous amounts of data and observations. Tycho Brahe's model, and Simon Schack updates it. There's a couple of things that Tycho Brahe didn't quite figure out, including Tycho Brahe actually didn't acknowledge the rotation of the Earth at first. At first he didn't. But his observations led to a model of the solar system that may be very accurate. And then with the updates that Simon Schach added, he takes the model of Tycho and he adds an S to the end for Simon Schach because he updated a couple more details, a couple more motions, incorporates those, and shows that it may very well be that our solar system's model is very close to what Tycho Brahe was arguing before Tycho's assistant and understudy, Kepler, took over and actually had to fudge some of the data to propose a more Copernican model where the Earth is hurtling around the sun at a tremendous rate of speed, like 30 kilometers per second. That's faster than any of these hypersonic weapons, that the most modern hypersonic weapons, talking about 7 kilometers a second or 10 kilometers a second, is totally terrifying. And so far, only Russia has been able to demonstrate that. The United States hasn't been able to demonstrate that at all. But supposedly under Kepler and Copernicus, the Earth is hurtling around at 30 kilometers a second, and yet no experiments have ever been able to verify that. No experiments to this day show conclusively a motion of the Earth moving anywhere close to 30 kilometers per second. In fact, the famous Michelson-Morley experiment, which was supposed to be measuring the movement of the Earth against an ether, it didn't find that the Earth was not moving. That's the way it's often described. Oh, there was no motion of the Earth. Actually, it showed that the Earth was moving, but very slowly, something like 1.6 kilometers per hour, not per second. And that's what the Tychos model argues, is that the Earth is actually caught in between a kind of a binary dance going on between the sun and Mars. I'm not going to get too into it because I've talked about it in other videos. I've had lots of other videos where we talk to Simon and we look at the Tychos model, the simulation that I'm going to show that Patrick Holmquist has created to test and show in conjunction with Simon how this model explains the observational data that we see. But in this model, the Earth is not hurtling around the sun, but rather the sun is making basically a circle in a binary dance with Mars, and the Earth is caught kind of in the middle, like in the eye of a hurricane, where this enormous solar system and all its activity is going around like a hurricane, and the Earth in the center is making a very slow motion, moving at about 1.6 kilometers per hour, very slowly, about 1 mile an hour basically, rather than hurtling around the sun as we're taught in the Copernican model. And not only are there no experiments, even with modern interferometers, that conclusively show that we're going any faster than that, but also the Copernican model fails to explain a mounting body of evidence, including the retrograde motions of the planets. The Copernican model has a tremendous problem with the retrograde motions of the planets, and yet the Tychos model not only explains them, but shows how their motions, they're not just an optical illusion, they're real. They're really changing their direction in space relative to the Earth. And as they do that, they change their direction and come straight towards the Earth, as I'll show in a little bit, in ways that might explain why, in astrology, retrogrades have such profound effects on life here on Earth, on our lives. When these different planets change direction, it's because they're part of this dance, this hurricane, this swirling hurricane that's going on around the Earth. And as they make these turns, they actually have a different direction in space towards us. So let me show you what I mean. So you can see what's going on here. The actual distances and sizes are all proportional and correct, except the actual planets and the Earth's moon had to be made bigger so that we could see them. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see them at all. So one thing that people initially complain about is, wait a minute, there's no way Mars gets that close to Earth or Venus gets that close to Earth. Well, it does. Mars gets 7 times brighter when it's coming towards us on a retrograde path than when it's at its farther points. And we'll see how the Tychos model explains that. So they do get significantly closer and farther away as they're going through this dance, but don't get hung up on the sizes, the relative sizes. Those had to be made larger so that you could see what's going on. And the orbit of the moon, that's the only one that's not proportional. Just so you could see it, it was enlarged a little bit. You can see the moon spinning around the Earth there at the center. So there at the center, you see the Earth. It's blue. It's got a little moon going around it. Then you've got the sun is basically dragging the rest of the solar system around it as it makes this circular path around the Earth. Now, as Simon Schack explains, it's not really orbiting the Earth. What's happening is, he argues that the sun and Mars are doing a binary dance very similar to Sirius A and Sirius B, and in fact that the sun and Mars have similar proportional sizes to Sirius A and Sirius B. And in between that dance, the Earth is caught near the barycenter, making this very slow precessional loop. And we won't get into that precessional loop right now, but notice as I turn on some of the traces of these different planets, I've turned on the trace of the largest planet, Jupiter, and it's got the largest dots. You can see what's happening. Jupiter is making these periodic retrogrades because the sun is making a circle. Jupiter is not changing its circular path. It's still making a circle around the sun. But as the sun makes this circle around in its own binary dance, it is tugging Jupiter along with it. I've also turned on the dots for Saturn. You can see Saturn down at the bottom of your screen. It's got a ring, the rings of Saturn. The sun making this circle is tugging the rest of the planets along so that even though they're making a circle, they make this trochoidal spirographic second loop due to the motion of the sun. And Simon Schack explains, and you can read his whole book online and get very into all the details and all the data, but it's just like if a cowboy was swinging a lasso, and in that lasso he had a chem light or a flashlight or something, and that cowboy was riding in a circle around us and at the same time spinning a light in a circle around his own head, the little light would appear to make little secondary loops, even though the lasso itself is just making a circle. Or if you put a light in the spokes of a wheel of a bicycle, the wheel itself is just making circles, but the light in the spokes, because of the wheel going around, the light that's off center is going to make little trochoidal patterns. So can you see what's happening? I'll zoom back out. The sun's motion is dragging the other planets. They are going in circles, but because of the sun's dragging, they're making these retrograde loops. Now, why is that so important? It's so important because, as I made a whole video about this, but I'll explain it briefly again, we cannot explain the motions of Mars under the conventional Copernican model. But this Tychos model explains the motions of Mars quite well, in fact, perfectly. Mars lines up with different external stars, and so we can tell where it is in space. And there's a star called Deneb el-Gedi. The name is Arabic and it means the tail of the goat. Deneb el-Gedi, tail, Deneb of the goat, al-Gedi. And that star, it's actually, I don't know why, but it's in the horns of the goat. I don't know why they called it Deneb el-Gedi. But anyway, that star, Mars aligns with, you can see Mars aligning perfectly with that star in the constellation Capricorn, the goat, periodically. And then you know, okay, well, Earth, Mars, and that star are in a perfect line. Of course, it'll line up with other stars as it goes around, all the planets. You could use the stars as kind of like reference points to figure out, okay, Mars or Jupiter or Saturn is aligned with that star. And that's called a sidereal interval, when it realigns with that same star. Sidereal simply means having to do with a star. So when Mars comes back around to a particular star, in this case we're using Deneb Algedi, that's a sidereal interval. Okay, how long does it take for Mars to get from one line up with that specific star in Capricorn and then line up with it again? Well, it turns out around 707 days. So it'll line up with that star, and then about 707 days later, it'll line up with that star again. But as Simon Shack explains, it does something unusual and unexpected, and it lines up for 7 times in the 700-day range, somewhere around in the 700s, and then the 8th time, it will line back up with that same star, Deneb Algedi, in a much shorter period, 541 days, and then it'll go on and go back to the 700s for 7 more times and then have another short interval. That unusual factor of Mars was understood by the ancient Maya. In fact, even though this nation-devouring parasite of biblical literalism came and destroyed almost all the sacred Maya texts when the Spanish Crusaders came over, the Spanish conquistadors came over to the Americas. They piled up all these sacred Maya texts and burned them. Only about 7 codexes survived from the pre-Columbus, pre-Spanish literalism invasion. But in one of those codexes, which is now known as the Dresden Codex, because it got taken back to Europe and it ended up in Dresden in modern-day Germany, the Dresden Codex, as some scholars pointed out around the year 2000, the Dresden Codex clearly shows that the Maya understood this weird interval behavior of Mars, where it has these long intervals and then after 7 long intervals, a short interval. Now, try and explain that with the Copernican theory. In his online book, he's made it all available for free. Simon Shack shows, well, the problem with 540 or so day interval is the Earth is supposed to be hurtling around the sun every 365 days, right? In the Copernican model. So 540 some odd days, let's say it takes 541 or 545 days, that's a year and a half. So now the Earth's on totally opposite side, and yet Mars is aligning perfectly. And the way that the orreries, the models that try and show, okay, here's where Mars and Earth are in the Copernican system, they don't work. You can do the 7 sidereal intervals, and Earth and Mars are all over the place, and the alignments are all going in directions they couldn't possibly be aligning with the same star. Here's the page from Simon Shack's online book, the Tychos model, that you can go check it out for yourself. And it's observable. Mars lines up with this specific star, and it's observable in its long and short intervals, and it's not explainable with the Copernican theory. The Copernican theory explains retrogrades as simply an optical illusion. When Earth is coming around, and I used to believe this, in fact, I've made videos where I've talked about it in the past as part of my star research, and then somebody made me, I'm very grateful to Gary, pointed me towards the Tychos model and said, you should check this out. And I said, oh, boy, that sounds really hard to get your head around, but I'll take a look at it. And, I was really skeptical, but the more I look at it, the more I realize the evidence, the more evidence that you look at, the more evidence there is that shows that the Copernican model cannot work. So the significance of this is the Tychos model, where the sun's motion is dragging those planets into these retrograde loops, drags them through space in a pattern that actually does make a loop in space relative to us. So I'll show it again on the Tychosium. If the sun is making this loop, a planet that's making a perfect circle in its orbit around the sun, it doesn't have to loop, it doesn't have to go backwards in its orbit at all, but the sun's motion will drag it through space in a way that makes this trochoidal motion with this internal loop. It will actually drag through space, and when it's making that loop, it will turn, instead of going sideways past the Earth, it'll turn towards us and make this loop, and that's when it retrogrades. And it's as if a freight train that's going around in a circle around us, periodically, instead of just going past us, left to right, sometimes turns and the freight train comes straight towards us and then makes a little loop, goes backwards against us, and then continues going left to right. And that's why you can understand, okay, if Mars and Jupiter and Saturn are freight trains, in fact, they're much bigger than freight trains, and they're normally going along kind of a left to right path, or they're normally going transverse to us, and then they suddenly turn towards us and steam right towards us and make this loop. Now you can understand why a retrograde might have an impact on us here on Earth. In fact, would have an impact on us here on Earth. And some people say, well, wait a minute. Why would it? Well, it may be that there's more involved than just gravity and mass. There may be electromagnetics that are also involved. The motion of the moon seems to have, as Simon Schach has proven, and he gives you all the data in the book, connections and harmonies to the motions of the planets. The motions of the planets have harmonies. They're interlocked in their cycles. And in fact, our moon has interlocking harmonies with all of the other orbiting bodies in the solar system. In other words, they're all connected somehow. Meaning, there may be electromagnetics or other interacting forces that we're not told about, or that in the general theory of the way the solar system is put together are totally ignored. In the way that the solar system is put together, there should be no correlation between the orbit of the moon on this third planet that's just hurtling around the sun like all the others, and the orbits of Mercury, Venus, all the way up to Jupiter and beyond. There shouldn't be correlations, and yet there are. There's harmonic correlations, meaning there's resonance or electromagnetism or other forces going on. And so when those planets are moving around, they're having resonances that impact us. And when they make these retrograde loops and turn and come barreling straight towards us like a freight train, they would impact us. They would impact life on Earth and our resonances. So let's take a look briefly. Like I said, I've made a whole separate video about this. You can also read Simon's book online. You can also check out the many interviews that Simon and Patrick have done with various podcast hosts on the internet and listen to their explanations, as well as interviews that I've done with them, along with Ksenia, my wife and partner, who is an astrologer. And I have to tell you, the retrogrades, see, I never would have understood or believed any of this, except the more I talk to Ksenia and the more I learn about what the retrogrades do and what they represent. You can check her material out about what a Mars retrograde does, or what a Jupiter retrograde does, or what a Mercury retrograde does. I won't embarrass myself by trying to explain it all, but those retrogrades, they explain a lot. There's a lot of the science of the retrogrades is observationally astonishing to me. The things that happen in a Mars retrograde, and we just turned into a Mars retrograde. So I'll show once again how the retrograde works. Let me show you a Mars retrograde here. I've recorded one on the Tychos model. You can see this is the dates that we're in right now. You can see what's going on in this recording. I'm going to start the Tychos model, and I'm going to put the tracer on so you can see the motion of Mars. And I'm starting here in 2021, and I'm running it, and I've got the trace on so you can see the pattern that Mars is making in the sky, the actual motion of Mars. Now notice, its orbit is a circle. It's making a circle around the sun, but these dots show its actual location in space. As it makes a circle around the sun drags it, and it traces out in space something that is not a circle. So here it goes. We're in 2021. You can see at the top the date in the upper right-hand corner. We're in 2021 in October. It's still going direct. It's not retrograde right now. It's moving through space. But as the sun drags it along, and as the sun makes its circle around the Earth, what you're going to see happen in 2022 is a retrograde. And that's starting to happen right now. Look, the sun is moving around to the other side of the Earth and pulling Mars closer to the Earth. It's going to start pulling it closer and closer and make this retrograde loop. As the sun goes around the other side of the Earth, it's going to pull Mars, and here it comes on a retrograde. So here we are. We're nearing the end of 2022. And you can see, look, at Mars is getting closer and closer to the Earth, and its forward progress has now slowed and then even turned, and now it's going retrograde. It's going the other way. It's still making its circle around the sun, but what's happened is the sun going around behind the Earth has pulled Mars towards the Earth and made this retrograde loop, and then off it goes again. Now, Simon and Patrick both explain the Copernican model has no good explanation for that loop either. If we're just all hurtling around the sun and sometimes we pass to the inside of Mars, why does Mars make a little loop in there? It would just be like, when you're passing a car on the freeway, they don't make a little loop. They just look like they're going backwards as you pass them, and then they start going forwards again once you get far enough away. They don't make a little loop. So what's going on there? What's going on is Mars is actually being dragged through space in that pattern that you're seeing, the little red dots that it's leaving behind, that's showing where it is in space. It's still making a circle, but it's being dragged in this trochoidal spirographic pattern. Now, here we are. We're in 2024 now. Mars is getting ready to make another retrograde. As I'm recording this, Mars has just begun retrograde. Here we are I'm recording this on December 6th, 2024 in Australia. Now look at the date on your screen. You can see we're passing the middle of 2024. We're in July and August. As we do so, you can see, look, the sun is pulling Mars in space towards the Earth again. It's like the freight train has stopped going past and has just turned right towards your house. Whoa, that's scary. Look at, here comes Mars, the freight train, and now it's going retrograde. You see that? Here we are. We moved into December. It went retrograde, still retrograde until about February of 2025 when it's finishing off its loop, but it's now going direct again. So you can see Mars actually makes this motion in space, comes steaming straight towards the Earth during a retrograde. And you can ask yourself, would that affect you? Electromagnetically, vibrationally, harmonically? If there are connections between the moon, the Earth, the other planets, they're all interlocked harmonically, would these retrograde loops harmonically affect you and me? Yes, they would. Yes, they would. And that's why astrology as a science talks about what's going on in the life of the individual and on the societal level. Just like the myths, talking about the gods and the goddesses that are given to every nation on earth, talk about the societal level and the individual level. And they're the pattern for having a healthy society and healthy individuals. But parasites don't want that. Parasites want to be able to devour the riches of a society without interference from the individuals banding together to get rid of the parasites. So they're going to destroy this knowledge. And that's exactly what we see going on since the rise of this nation-devouring biblical literalism. Now, you might also say, well, today there's not as many people believe in biblical literalism. Well, don't be so sure. There's still quite a few. But this parasitic nation-devouring behavior is still going on. It absolutely is still going on. So this ancient knowledge is for our benefit on the individual level and the societal level. It is operating in the ancient myths that are connected to the stars, and those ancient sciences and traditions like astrology and other ancient practices that benefit the individual and the society. They were given to us for our benefit, but something has been trying to keep us from understanding that and from seeing that. Now let me show you just briefly how the Tychos model shows the sidereal intervals. I've shown this before, but let's just show it. We'll start the Tychos simulation. You can see what's happening is on the long sidereal intervals, there's an actual retrograde loop during that 700 plus day count before it lines back up with Deneb El Gedi. And it's going to do that 7 times, and on the 8th, because of the geometry and the cyclical, the way the cycles align, Mars will come back and line back up with that star just before it starts a retrograde loop. So if those retrograde loops are real, with Mars actually making a retrograde loop through space, that's why if you cut out a retrograde loop, it makes a big difference in the day count. But if the retrogrades are just an optical illusion, like we're told, oh, retrograde is just Earth is passing to the inside of Mars, or Earth is passing to the outside of Venus, and so it makes it look like it's going the other way. Well, it's just an optical illusion. It wouldn't change the day count at all. But with the Tychos model, those planets are actually tracing this out in the sky, even though they're still going in circles, as I've got to emphasize that. It's hard to get your head around at first, but once you do start to look at it and read Simon's online material, and I encourage everyone to buy the hard copy of the book as well, and look at the Tychosium and play with it yourself and play with the different tracing features, you can see how it works. The motion of the sun actually drags those planets in retrograde loops through space relative to the Earth. They're actually moving through space. They're tracing out that loop, so it will take longer if there's a loop before it lines up with a star. And after 7 of those, Mars lines up with that star just before a loop, so it will take about 200 days less, just because you've left out the loop. And that's why retrograde loops are so important. They actually influence life here on Earth, because the planets are actually getting much closer and impacting us. And so listen to Ksenia's explanation of the way Saturn goes through a sign. It does 3 retrograde loops. It plows through that sign with 3 retrograde loops during its transit through that sign. And each of those retrograde loops, it's having an impact on us. And it's plowing it 3 times before it moves on. It's fascinating. It's just fascinating. The impact of a Mars retrograde loop. I happen to have been born during a Mars retrograde. We're in one right now. The teachings that have come down through the millennia about what these different planetary motions do to us are astonishingly accurate. I was never one to understand that or give it any credence, but it may well be that The Tychos model helps us to understand scientifically why those planets' motions have such an impact on us here on Earth. Thanks so much for listening.